Hi, I'm Amy and this is A-Star Reads. I'm gonna finally do my November nonfiction review. I try to do this every single month for the nonfiction books I read that month, and this month I only got to one, but it was a pretty compelling book. I read Custer Died for Your Sins by Vine Deloria Jr, and it actually took me quite a while to get through this hefty dude. I mean, it's not huge, but it was so dense. There was a lot of information in here, and because it was written in 1969, there was a lot that I didn't really understand. Especially when it came to the politics of the time and the social programs and the welfare programs at the time. He was discussing a lot of things that was frankly over my head, to be honest. I would probably give it a 3.5 stars. I feel like that under other circumstances, I would probably rate it higher, and I'll explain that in a minute. But for my purposes, I learned so much from this. It was incredibly dense, so I couldn't really read more than 25 pages a day. It didn't necessarily, like I said, it was written in 1969, so I don't know that it ages perfectly well, because there's a lot that you can glean from this, because there's a lot of things that haven't changed, but at the same time, someone that is alive now may not know all the details that he talks about in that period of history. There were some parts that were really easy to get into, really exciting to read, and you kind of flew through those sections, and then there were other parts that were just so dense and a little tedious that those are the ones that I had a hard time getting through. So the reason I say that it might be a higher score depending on the circumstance is that I feel like this would be an amazing book to buddy read with other people. Each individual section is on kind of a different topic, and if you were to go through each individual section and read it with somebody else and then discuss it, I think it would then be a lot easier to digest some of the material. And this book actually lends very well to discussion, to group discussion. We talked about it in my nonfiction book club last night, and this was one of the best nonfiction book clubs we've had in a while. Another thing that's really important about this book, and which I realized last night, was that a lot of people really don't know anything about Native American history. They know what history Native Americans have been given, because Native Americans have been given a history by the US, by people who have come here and colonized the land. But they really don't know hardly anything about most Native communities. The other reason I feel like I might rate this differently is because I feel like this would be an amazing book to read alongside a class like a sovereignty class or a class about Native American history, because then you would be able to have an expert who could tell you more about what has happened since then. There's so much from this book that I'm like, well, has that changed since? I don't know. I would love a companion piece. If someone out there could come up with a book that kind of discusses this now and how things either have or haven't changed. I know certain parts of this where it hasn't changed. It would be interesting to kind of then use this as a reference for that. So what's this book about? Well, this is Vine Deloria's Indian Manifesto, so that says a lot right there. His intention of this book is to let you know the reality for Native Americans, not what the government, not what society has made you believe is true for Native Americans, not what you know from Tonto and all those different characters on TV. He wants you to know what's real for Native Americans. He wants you to know the things they're dealing with, the struggles they have to face, and why this should be important to everyone. Because realistically, so many people want to help Native Americans, at least they did in the 1960s. They wanted to be the saviors in a sense, but they weren't actually helping them. So he wants you to know what can be done to help. He gets to a point where he's kind of saying, you know, it's still that colonialism mentality to feel you need to save the Native Americans. What they would like is to have a nation where they can provide for their own and be given the freedom to live the life that they would like to live. He goes into different sections in this, and the very first section talks the most about how Indians are perceived in the US, how they have been given a heritage, given an image, given a culture that doesn't actually reflect what any Native American really does live their life like, and how it's been detrimental to not only the way Native Americans live their life, but also how they've been perceived and then treated by the government here in the US. Then he goes on to talk about laws and treaties. Treaties are a really important subject because so many treaties were created with the US with so many promises, and yet consistently, ever since those treaties were created, they have been completely ignored. Most Native communities just want those treaties to be recognized and followed, because that was an agreement they made with the US to move to reservations, to give up land. And the fact that they made that agreement and the US said, yes, we will do this for you, so that we can take that land of yours, but then they never honored those treaties. It was really an unjust use of power. That was a really important section, but it was a section that kind of went over my head a little bit. The next section was about Termination, and I really didn't know anything about Termination. Termination was this period of history where the US wanted to cut off Native Americans from federal support. And Natives wanted that too because they wanted to have autonomy, but at the same time, the US took everything from them and then wanted to cut them off without any resources or any ways of making money. And so it was an absolute failure the way they wanted to do it. There's two really funny sections. One's all about anthropologists, and if you're an anthropologist, I apologize, but Vine Deloria Jr. does not like anthropologists, especially not anthropologists from the 1960s, that era. He has a really good solution, in my opinion, to how anthropologists should operate with Native American tribes, and I thought that that was one of the most clever parts of this book that I really, really enjoyed. But yeah, it's an interesting section. It's funny. He does not like anthropologists for very valid reasons. But if that's something that might trigger you, just beware of that. And then he also has a section on Indian humor, which I thought was just charming. It was a great section. He really discusses how a lot of Indian humor sort of has been grown from a lot of their experiences throughout history with the US. And so there's definitely a tongue-in-cheek sarcasticness to his writing in general and to a lot of Native American humor because of their experiences. Then he has a section that's all about missionaries, and he has very strong opinions about the Christian religion within Native culture. He was thinking about going into the seminary himself, and he actually did go to a seminary school, and this is where he started getting a lot of realizations about what kind of damage the missionaries did in coming to the tribes. They came with the intention of helping the natives, but that is not what actually happened. Then the next section is called The Red and the Black. During the time that he wrote this, the civil rights movement was huge, and he was doing comparisons between the plight of Black Americans and Native Americans and how they've been dealing with trying to not only get the rights that they were owed, but also to unify. So he talks a lot about unification and why it's been really difficult for Native Americans to unify. And in that same vein, he talks about leadership and also why it's been so difficult to have distinct leaders within the Native community. You look at the civil rights movement and you had Martin Luther King Jr., you had a lot of other leaders that were able to sort of act as figureheads for the whole group. And that isn't true for Native cultures because they're all individual nations. I think that was a thing that was really important about this book that people in the US don't understand. Native Americans are not all the same. They don't all come from the same culture. They come from independent nations and they're unique, just as unique as any country in Europe, say. That was a really interesting section, and some of the parts of that were definitely over my head because I wasn't alive during the civil rights movement, and he was talking about specific figures, specific events, specific groups, and so it was good. It was important to read about his comparison, especially during that time, but I didn't always catch every single thing. And then he talks about Indians in modern society. His tone changes quite a bit in the book at this point. There were some parts towards the end of the book that I was kind of like, well, he was, I don't want to say he was contradicting himself, but he was kind of changing his opinion about some of the things that he didn't want to see happen in the beginning. I guess accepting that to look into the future, natives will have to find ways to progress. And so he draws some comparisons and whatnot that I was a little like, huh, okay, that's strange. He was talking a lot about comparing corporations and tribalism. And he really did a whole section comparing the two and talking about how corporations are tribalism. And it's like the US's attempt to tribalize. And so that section was maybe more relevant in the 1960s than I feel it is today, because my opinion on corporations now is not the same as maybe they would have been back in the 60s. I don't know. It was kind of a strange section. I didn't really know what to draw from that. Like I said, I think this would lend really well to buddy reading, because then all the things that you're kind of unsure about as you go through, you can discuss with someone and then maybe come to a better understanding as to why that's being presented in whatever way it was. This is a book that you can learn so much from, and this is a great asset to any education into Native American history, policy. If you want to just learn something you didn't know, read this book. Like I said, he has a very tongue-in-cheek humor. He's very, very frustrated with white American culture, and to me, it's all completely understandable. But if that's something that would cause you to become quite defensive, this might not be the best intro into Native American history for you. Custer Died for Your Sins, 3.5 stars, although it was really hard to rate this one because I feel like situationally it might be different. I hope you enjoyed this review. Click that like button right now so you can see more of my monthly nonfiction reviews. And thank you so much for watching. I will see you soon for my November wrap up. Thanks, bye.